The sticky, oppressive humidity of a southern night can feel like a judgment. For one man, it became a crucible. We're about to tell you the story of Marcus Hale, a decorated Army veteran and a man of unshakable integrity who drove into the town of Harmony Creek looking for a fresh start. But on his very first night, before he could even introduce himself, he was met with the town's ugliest secret. Two of its police officers, men sworn to protect and serve, decided to have a little fun. This isn't just a story about a mistaken identity, it's a story about the deep-seated arrogance of power and the terrifying speed at which karma can come to collect its debt. What happened on that deserted county road would ignite a fire that would either purify Harmony Creek or burn it to the ground. The Welcome to Harmony Creek sign was peeling, the cheerful cursive script a cruel irony against the faded paint and rust stains. It sagged to one side like a drunkard leaning against a post. Marcus Hale noted it with a wry smile. He'd seen signs like this before in towns that clung to a past that never really existed for men who looked like him. He eased his foot off the accelerator of his modest sedan. He could have driven his new city-issued vehicle, a gleaming black SUV, but that wasn't the point. The point was to arrive quietly, to observe, to feel the town's pulse before it knew a new heart was coming to regulate its rhythm. Marcus was a man carved from discipline and experience. His time as a major in the Army Rangers had chiseled away anything soft, and his subsequent years rising through the ranks of a major city police department had sharpened his edges. He was hired to be the new chief of police in Harmony Creek, a town whose council desperately wanted to fix its reputation after a series of scandals involving the old guard. They wanted a reformer, an outsider, someone immune to the town's ingrained good old boy network. They had no idea how much of an outsider they were getting. A sudden violent shudder ran through the car, followed by the rhythmic thump of a flat tire. Marcus cursed under his breath, a rare indulgence. He guided the car to the gravel shoulder of the deserted county road. The cypress trees draped in Spanish moss seemed to claw at the twilight sky. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the chirping of crickets was deafening. He got out, the humidity instantly clinging to his polo shirt. The rear passenger side tire was completely shredded. It wasn't just a puncture, it looked like he'd run over a strip of metal. As he popped the trunk and pulled out the spare and the jack, a pair of headlights sliced through the gloom, slowing as they approached. A Harmony Creek Police Department cruiser. Perfect, Marcus thought with a sigh of relief. A chance to see his new officers in action. The cruiser pulled up behind him, its spotlight flooding him in a harsh, accusatory glare. Two officers emerged, their silhouettes broad and imposing against the strobing lights. The older of the two, a man with a heavy gut straining the buttons of his uniform, ambled forward. His name tag read Keller. The younger one, leaner and with a nervous energy, hung back. His tag read Reed. Well, what have we got here? Officer Vance Keller drawled, his voice a gravelly mix of boredom and contempt. He deliberately let his eyes roam over Marcus's dark skin, his clean-cut clothes, and the respectable but unremarkable car. Bit of car trouble? Yes, officer, Marcus said, his voice calm and even. He kept his hands visible, away from his pockets. He knew the drill. Looks like I ran over something, just about to change the tire. You from around here? Keller asked, ignoring the jack in Marcus's hand. The question was a test. Just passing through, Marcus replied, keeping his story simple. He wasn't officially chief until he was sworn in soon. Until then, he was just another black man on the side of a dark road. Passing through, Keller repeated, tasting the words. He shared a smirk with Officer Caleb Reed, who offered a weak, complicit smile in return. People who are just passing through our town at this time of night are usually up to no good. You got any ID on you, friend? Marcus nodded slowly. Of course. It's in my wallet, in my back right pocket. May I retrieve it? Keller grunted an affirmative. Marcus moved with deliberate slowness, pulling out his wallet and handing over his Pennsylvania driver's license. Keller squinted at it. Marcus Hale from Philly, huh? That's a long way from home. What brings you down to our quiet little corner of the world? Visiting family, Marcus lied smoothly. Family? Keller scoffed, handing the license to Reed to run. You don't look like any of the families I know around here. The implication hung in the humid air, as thick and unpleasant as the swarm of mosquitoes buzzing around the squad car's lights. Reed returned from the car a minute later. "He's clean, Vance. No wants, no warrants." Keller looked genuinely disappointed. He handed the license back to Marcus. "All right, Mr. Hale. Looks like your story checks out for now." He paused, a cruel glint in his eyes. "You know, we have a real problem with folks dumping trash out on these county roads. Old tires, busted furniture, you name it, we take it very seriously." "I'm just changing a flat, officer," Marcus stated, his patience beginning to fray. "Is that what you're doing?" Keller said, his voice taking on a mocking tone. He took a step closer, invading Marcus's personal space. "Or were you about to dump this busted tire in our woods? Save yourself a few bucks at the landfill." Marcus stared at him, his face an unreadable mask. He could see the game. This wasn't about law and order. This was a power trip. A bit of roadside entertainment for two bored cops on a quiet night shift. "No, officer," Marcus said, his voice dropping an octave, gaining a hard, steely edge. "I was not." The shift in tone seemed to provoke Keller. His folksy demeanor vanished, replaced by pure venom. "You getting smart with me, boy? You think you can come down here from your big city and talk back to the law in Harmony Creek?" He turned to his partner. "Reed, I think Mr. Hale needs to learn a little something about Southern hospitality." Reed shifted his feet, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. "Vance, maybe we should just let him change his tire and go. It's getting late." "Nonsense," Keller boomed, clapping Reed on the back with enough force to make him stumble. "We're a welcoming committee. We're about to make sure Mr. Hale has a night in Harmony Creek he'll never, ever forget." A cold dread, an emotion Marcus hadn't felt since his tours overseas, began to coil in his stomach. Not fear for his safety, but a profound disgust. He had come here to fix a broken system, and he was staring into the very heart of the disease. The switch from veiled insinuation to overt aggression was instantaneous. Keller's face flushed and beaded with sweat under the patrol car's lights, twisted into a mask of smug authority. "Put your hands on the trunk of your car now," Keller commanded. Marcus didn't move. He stood straight, his gaze locked on Keller. "For what reason, officer?" "For contempt of an officer, resisting arrest, and because I damn well said so," Keller spat, his hand dropping to the butt of his service pistol. It wasn't a threat to draw, but a reminder of the power he held. "Now I'm not going to ask you again." Reed, looking increasingly uncomfortable, chimed in. "Vance, come on. Let's just write him a ticket for littering or something and be done with it." "Shut up, Reed," Keller snapped, never taking his eyes off Marcus. "You need to learn how we handle things down here. This is how we keep the peace. We set a tone." Marcus knew he had a choice. He could reveal himself right there, pull out his new badge, and Chief of Police identification. The thought was tempting. The image of the blood draining from Keller's face was a delicious one, but it would be a hollow victory. It would solve the problem of this one moment, but it wouldn't expose the rot. To cut out a cancer, you first have to see how far it has spread. He needed to know just how far they would go when they believed there were no consequences. With a deep, controlled breath, Marcus turned and placed his hands flat on the trunk of his Ford Fusion. The metal was still warm from the engine. The search was rough and humiliatingly thorough. Keller's hands patted him down with unnecessary force, lingering, searching for a reaction, finding nothing but a phone and keys. Keller seemed to grow more frustrated. "So, no weapons, no drugs," he said, his voice laced with theatrical disappointment. "Just a smart mouth and a bad attitude. We can work with that." He pulled a pair of heavy-duty zip ties from his belt. "Turn around, hands behind your back." Marcus complied, his mind a whirlwind of cold fury. He cataloged every detail. The location, the exact words spoken, Reed's hesitant complicity, Keller's gleeful malice. He was no longer a victim, he was an investigator gathering evidence. With the zip ties cinched painfully tight around his wrists, Keller shoved him toward the side of the road near an old rusted utility pole, half swallowed by kudzu vines. "What are you doing, Vance?" Reed's voice was barely a whisper. This was clearly beyond what he had expected. "Teaching a lesson," Keller said, his eyes glittering. "This is a community service project. Mr. Hale was worried about dumping his trash, so we're going to make sure he doesn't become trash on the side of our road. We're just securing him for his own safety until he calms down and decides to be more respectful." The excuse was so flimsy, so transparently false, that it was more insulting than the act itself. Keller pushed Marcus hard against the pole, his face scraping against the creosote-treated wood. He took another long zip tie and looped it around Marcus's chest and the pole, pulling it brutally tight. He did the same with another one around his legs. Marcus was pinned immobile, facing the dark, insect-infested woods. "There," Keller said, stepping back to admire his work. "Now you can take a moment to reflect on the importance of respecting law enforcement in Harmony Creek." He leaned in close, his breath sour with the smell of stale coffee and chewing tobacco. "You'll be here a while, maybe until the morning shift finds you. Depends on how busy we get." Marcus remained silent, his breathing steady. He refused to give them the satisfaction of a plea or a struggle. His silence seemed to infuriate Keller more than any curse could. "Nothing to say now, huh? Big man from the big city is all quiet now." Keller laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that echoed in the night. He turned to his partner. "See, Reed, that's how it's done. You show them who's in charge. They learn fast." Reed wouldn't look at Marcus. He stared at the ground, at the toes of his boots, anywhere but at the man they had just tied to a pole. A small, withered piece of his conscience was still alive, squirming in the darkness. "Let's go, Vance," Reed urged, his voice tight. "We made our point." All right, I'm coming," Keller said, still chuckling. He gave the pole one last pat as if it were an old friend. "You have a good night now, Mr. Hale. Enjoy the scenery. Don't let the fire ants bite." The two officers got back in their cruiser. For a moment they just sat there, their figures silhouetted by the dashboard lights. Then with a final mocking blip of the siren, they pulled away, their red and blue lights painting the trees before disappearing down the road. Marcus was left alone. The sudden silence was more profound than the noise had been. He was bound to a pole on a deserted road in a town he was supposed to lead. The zip ties cut into his wrists, and the rough wood of the pole dug into his back. The mosquitoes, sensing a stationary target, descended in a hungry cloud. But through the pain and the humiliation, a cold, hard clarity began to form. This was no longer just a job. He wasn't just here to reform a police department. He was here to dismantle it piece by rotten piece and rebuild it from the foundation up. Keller and Reed thought they were teaching him a lesson. The terrible irony was that they had just given their new chief of police all the motivation he would ever need. The war for Harmony Creek had begun, and they had just handed him his cause. The hours passed with excruciating slowness. Marcus focused on his breathing, a technique he had mastered in the military to control pain and fear. He listened to the night sounds, distinguishing the call of a whippoorwill from the rustle of a small animal in the undergrowth. He felt the dew settle on his clothes, chilling him to the bone. Each passing set of headlights on the main highway a mile away was a fleeting spark of hope that died as it faded into the distance. Humiliation was a fire, and Marcus let it burn, forging his anger into something cold and sharp. He wasn't thinking about revenge in the hot-blooded sense. He was planning. He was strategizing. He was composing the opening moves of a campaign. It was still dark when a pickup truck, old and rattling, slowed to a stop. A farmer, a man named George Harlan, on his way to the early market, peered out his window. His face, etched with the lines of a lifetime of hard work, registered shock and then concern. "Mister, you all right?" he called out, his voice wary. "I'd be a lot better if you could cut me loose," Marcus said, his own voice hoarse. George hesitated for only a second before grabbing a large pair of wire cutters from his toolbox. He approached cautiously, his eyes taking in the scene. He saw the police-grade zip ties. Was this officers of the law that did this?" he asked, his voice low with disbelief. "Yes," Marcus said simply. George shook his head, snipping the thick plastic ties around Marcus's body and then his wrists. "Something's got to change," the farmer muttered. "This ain't right." Marcus rubbed his wrists, the blood rushing back in a painful wave of pins and needles. "Thank you, Mr. Harlan. You have no idea how much I appreciate this." "How do you know my name?" George asked, surprised. "I saw it on the side of your truck," Marcus replied, pointing to the faded Harlan and Sons Produce logo on the door. He offered a hand. "I'm Marcus Hale." George shook it. his grip firm. He offered Marcus a ride and a bottle of water. Marcus accepted both gratefully. He had George drop him at a 24-hour diner on the outskirts of town, assuring the farmer he could handle it from there. He called a cab, went to the small house the city had rented for him, showered, and put on the uniform of the chief of police of Harmony Creek. The fabric was crisp, the badge a heavy, significant weight over his heart. He looked at his reflection in the mirror. The man looking back was not the victim tied to a pole. He was the consequence. At the start of the morning shift, Marcus Hale walked into the Harmony Creek Police Department. The building smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant. A sergeant at the front desk, a heavy-set woman named Brenda, looked up, her expression shifting from curiosity to confusion. "Can I help you, sir?" "I'm here for the morning briefing," Marcus said, his voice calm and resonant in the small lobby. "That's for officers only," she started to say, but then her eyes fell on the 4 gleaming stars on his collar. Her jaw went slack. You must be Chief Hale. We weren't expecting you until later." "Plans changed," Marcus said, walking past her toward the briefing room. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room fell silent. About 15 officers were scattered around the tables, nursing coffee cups and joking with one another. Their laughter died in their throats. All eyes turned to him. He scanned their faces, a mix of surprise, apprehension, and from a few outright hostility. And then he saw them. Dale Keller and Kevin Reed were sitting at a table in the back. Keller was in the middle of telling a story, a wide grin on his face. As Marcus entered, the grin froze, melting into a state of utter confusion. Reed saw Marcus next, and every drop of color drained from his face. He looked like he'd seen a ghost. Keller squinted, his brain struggling to process the impossible image before him. He saw the face of the man from the roadside, the man he'd left humiliated and bound in the dark. But now that face was attached to a crisp, new chief's uniform. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The coffee cup in his hand trembled, rattling against the saucer. Marcus walked to the front of the room, his footsteps echoing in the stunned silence. He placed his hands on the lectern and let his gaze sweep across the room, finally landing on the 2 officers in the back. He held their stare for 5 long, unbearable seconds. "Good morning," Marcus began, his voice dangerously quiet, yet it commanded the attention of every person in the room. "I am Marcus Hale. As of this moment, I am your new chief of police. It seems my arrival in your town has been eventful." He let that hang in the air. You could have heard a pin drop. "I've always believed that to understand an organization, you have to see it when it thinks no one is watching," he continued, his eyes still locked on Keller and Reed. "Last night I was given an unscheduled, unofficial, and deeply illuminating introduction to the standards of the Harmony Creek Police Department, courtesy of Officers Keller and Reed." A collective gasp went through the room. Officers turned their heads to stare at the 2 men whose faces were now masks of pure, unadulterated terror. Keller looked like he was going to be sick. Reed looked like he was about to faint. "I learned about their unique approach to community outreach," Marcus went on, his voice dripping with ice, "their methods for handling stranded motorists, and their profound commitment to teaching lessons." He paused, looking directly at the 2 officers. Officer Keller, Officer Reed, front and center, now. It wasn't a request. It was an order forged in the fires of a cold, humiliating ordeal. Shaking, moving as if their limbs were made of lead, the 2 men rose and stumbled to the front of the room. They stood before their new chief, unable to meet his eyes. The men who had been predators in the dark were now just pathetic, trembling figures in the harsh light of day. "Hand me your badges," Marcus commanded, his voice like the crack of a whip, "and your service weapons." Their hands shaking so violently they could barely unclip their holsters, they did as they were told. Marcus took the items and placed them on the lectern with a loud, definitive clatter. "Officers Dale Keller and Kevin Reed," Marcus announced to the silent, astonished room, "you are hereby suspended without pay, effective immediately, pending a full internal affairs investigation which I will be personally conducting. Get out of my briefing room. Get out of my station. You are a disgrace to the uniform you wear." The expulsion of Keller and Reed from the briefing room was like pulling the pin on a grenade. The immediate explosion of shock was followed by a tense, uncertain silence as the remaining officers stared at their new chief. They saw no gloating in his eyes, no satisfaction. They saw only a cold, unyielding resolve. "Let me be perfectly clear," Marcus said, his voice cutting through the tension. "What happened last night was not just an assault on me, it was an assault on the badge you all wear. It was a symptom of a disease that has been allowed to fester in this department for too long. The good old boy system ends today. The culture of unaccountability ends today. The belief that you are above the law you are sworn to uphold, it ends right now." He scanned the faces before him. He saw fear, resentment, but also, in a few, a flicker of something else. Hope. One of those faces belonged to Detective Sofia Ramirez. A sharp, overlooked detective in her late 30s, Ramirez had a reputation for being thorough and unshakably ethical, which had earned her few friends among the department's ruling clique. She had been consistently passed over for promotions in favor of men like Keller. She watched Marcus Hale now, not with fear, but with a cautious, analytical curiosity. "Sergeant Brenda," Marcus called out, his voice sharp, "secure the service weapons and badges of Keller and Reed in the evidence vault. I want their lockers sealed and their access to all department systems revoked immediately. I want their patrol car impounded and processed for a full forensic workup by an outside lab." Brenda, who had been watching from the doorway with wide eyes, straightened up. "Yes, Chief." For the first time in years, she felt a surge of respect for the man in charge. "The rest of you," Marcus continued, addressing the room, "your shifts will continue as assigned. But know this, I will be reviewing everything. Every arrest report, every use of force complaint, every piece of evidence logged. I am opening the books. If you have done your job with integrity, you have nothing to fear. If you have not, I suggest you start praying." He dismissed them. The officers filed out in silence, whispering amongst themselves, the department's social order shattering in real time. Marcus's first call was to the city manager, Garrett Kane, a man who had staked his own career on hiring an outsider to clean up the force. "Garrett, it's Marcus Hale. We have a situation." He calmly and factually recounted the events of the previous night, leaving out none of the humiliating details. There was a long, stunned silence on the other end of the line. "My God, Marcus, I don't know what to say. Are you all right?" "I'm fine, Garrett, but the department is not. I've suspended the 2 officers involved. I'm launching a full investigation, not just into them, but into the entire department's practices. I need your full and public backing. No wavering." "You have it," Kane said, his voice firming up with anger at what had happened. 100%. Whatever you need, resources, legal support, anything." Marcus's next move was to call a press conference for that afternoon. He knew the story would get out, and he intended to control the narrative. He would not allow it to be spun as a personal vendetta. This was about policy and principle. He spent the next hours in his new office, a space still smelling of the stale cigar smoke of his predecessor. He requested the personnel files for Keller and Reed. As he read, a sickening pattern emerged. Keller's file was thick with citizen complaints. All of them dismissed as unfounded by the previous chief. Allegations of excessive force, illegal searches, and verbal abuse, particularly against minority residents and out-of-towners. He was a predator who had been protected by the system. Reed's file was different. It was thin, with a few commendations for minor things, but there was a note from his field training officer years prior. Officer Reed shows potential, but displays a concerning lack of initiative and a tendency to follow the lead of senior officers without question, even when protocol is breached. He was a follower, a man whose weakness made him complicit. Late in the morning, there was a soft knock on his door. It was Detective Sofia Ramirez. "Chief Hale?" she said, holding a file. "May I have a word?" "Come in, Detective," Marcus said, gesturing to a chair. "I heard what happened, Chief, and I wanted to say I'm not surprised." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Keller and his crew have been running this place for a long time. They do what they want, and everyone else just looks the other way because it's easier." "Why didn't anyone file a formal report?" Marcus asked. Ramirez gave a short, bitter laugh. "To who? The last chief was Keller's fishing buddy. Any complaint that went up the chain disappeared. I tried once early in my career over a mishandled domestic violence case. I was on traffic duty for months straight as a result. Marcus nodded slowly. He recognized her type. The capable, principled officer who was marginalized by a corrupt system. She was exactly the kind of person he needed. "What's in the file, detective?" She pushed it across the desk. "This might be nothing, but you said you were opening the books. This is a case Keller handled years ago. A hit and run. A teenage kid from the poor side of town was killed on his bike. The case was closed. Lack of evidence," she said, making air quotes. "I always thought something was off. The kid who died had just had a fight with the son of Robert Bennett." "Robert Bennett?" Marcus asked. "The man who owns half the businesses downtown." "The same," Ramirez confirmed. "Bennett's son, a spoiled brat named Kyle, was a known reckless driver. The timeline fit, but his alibi was solid. He was supposedly at a party. Keller personally took his statement and cleared him within hours. It all felt too neat, too quick." Marcus opened the file. "You think Keller buried it?" "I think Keller had a very close and very profitable relationship with Robert Bennett," Ramirez said, her eyes meeting his. "If you're looking for where the rot starts, Chief, that's a good place to start digging." Marcus looked from the file to the determined face of the detective. He had spent the night being victimized by the worst of his department. Now in the light of day, he was discovering its best. "Detective Ramirez," he said, a small, grim smile touching his lips for the first time that day. "Welcome to the investigation." The internal investigation began like a controlled demolition. Marcus and Ramirez started with the small, visible cracks, knowing they would lead to the compromised foundations. While Marcus handled the official side, the press conference, meetings with the city council, and fielding furious calls from Keller's union representative, Ramirez began her work in the shadows of the evidence room and the records archive. At the press conference, Marcus was a portrait of calm authority. He detailed the incident in professional, unflinching terms, framing it not as a personal attack, but as an egregious failure of policing standards. He announced the immediate implementation of mandatory body cameras for all officers, a revised use of force policy, and a new independent citizen oversight committee. The news sent shockwaves through the community. The local paper, the Harmony Creek Chronicle, ran a front-page headline, "New Chief's Shocking First Night." Meanwhile, Keller and Reed were spiraling. Dale Keller, arrogant and accustomed to impunity, was enraged. He hired a bulldog of a lawyer, a man named Frank Miller, who immediately went on the offensive, claiming the new chief had a vendetta and was manufacturing a story to purge the Department of Veteran Officers. Keller truly believed he could beat it. He thought his connections, his years of favors, would protect him. Kevin Reed, however, was crumbling. His wife, Sarah, a school teacher with a strong moral compass, was horrified by the news. She looked at her husband with a mixture of pity and disgust. "You tied a man to a pole, Kevin, for fun?" she had asked him, her voice trembling with disbelief. "What is wrong with you? That's not the man I married." "We were just scaring him a little," Kevin stammered, the excuse sounding pathetic even to his own ears. "You're a police officer, not a schoolyard bully. You have a daughter. What kind of example are you setting for her?" The shame was eating him alive. He wasn't sleeping. He jumped every time the phone rang. The solid ground of his life had turned to quicksand. Back at the station, Ramirez was making progress. She pulled the financial disclosure forms for the entire department. Keller's was a work of fiction. He reported his modest officer's salary, yet he owned a bass boat worth a small fortune, took annual vacations to the Caribbean, and had just paid for his son's first year of college in cash. The math didn't add up. Then she found the link. A small, unassuming LLC called HC Security Consulting. It was a shell company, and its sole client was Bennett Enterprises. The company had been paying a consulting fee for years. The payments went to a bank account controlled by one person, Dale Keller. "It's more than a buried hit and run," Ramirez told Marcus, laying the bank statements on his desk. "This is a protection racket. Bennett pays Keller to make his problems go away. A troublesome tenant, a business rival, a son who gets into trouble. Keller takes care of it. Marcus stared at the documents. The depravity of it was staggering. It wasn't just racism, it was deep-seated systemic corruption. The incident on the county road wasn't an anomaly. It was the natural behavior of a man who believed he was untouchable. The next step was to find leverage against Reed. Marcus knew the younger officer was the weak link. He wasn't the mastermind, he was the accomplice, driven by fear and a desperate need for approval. They dug into Reed's activity logs and body cam footage from previous months. The department had a few older cameras that were rarely used. They found what they were looking for, a traffic stop from months ago. Reed had pulled over a young black man for a broken taillight. The footage showed Keller, who arrived as backup, planting a small baggie of marijuana in the man's glove compartment while Reed was distracted. Reed's report made no mention of it, and the young man, unable to afford a good lawyer, took a plea deal. He was currently serving time in the county jail. "We've got him," Marcus said, his voice grim. "This is felony evidence tampering and perjury. Reed's looking at prison time." He asked Ramirez to arrange a meeting, not an official interrogation but a conversation. He had Detective Ramirez bring Kevin Reed to a neutral location, a quiet corner of a public park. Reed arrived looking haggard, his eyes bloodshot. He sat on the park bench opposite Marcus, looking like a man on his way to his own execution. Marcus didn't start with threats. He started with a question. "Officer Reed, I've read your file. You joined the force because you wanted to follow in your grandfather's footsteps. You wrote in your academy essay that you wanted to help people and be a force for good. Do you remember that?" Reed flinched, then nodded mutely, his eyes welling with tears. "Look at where you are now, Kevin," Marcus said, his voice firm but not unkind. "You're a party to evidence tampering, official oppression, and God knows what else Dale Keller has dragged you into. His loyalty won't save you. When he goes down, he will throw you under the bus without a second thought to lighten his own sentence." Marcus slid a folder across the picnic table. It contained stills from the body cam footage of the planted drugs. That young man, James Peterson, lost his scholarship because of that conviction. He's in jail right now for a crime he didn't commit. Because of you. Is that being a force for good? Kevin Reed finally broke. A choked sob escaped his lips, and he buried his face in his hands. The weight of his cowardice, of all the times he'd stayed silent, came crashing down on him. He made me do it," Reed whispered through his sobs. "Keller, he said it was how things worked. He said if I wasn't with him, I was against him. This is your one and only chance to be with the right side," Marcus said, his voice low and intense. "You can be the man who enabled Dale Keller, or you can be the man who helped stop him. You can save yourself, Kevin, but to do it, you have to tell us everything. Everything about Keller, everything about Robert Bennett, the hit and run, the payoffs, all of it." Reed looked up, his face a mess of tears and desperation. He saw no malice in Marcus Hale's eyes, only a hard, unwavering demand for the truth. He looked at the evidence against him, thought of his wife's disappointed face, his daughter's innocent eyes, and the life he was about to lose. The choice was brutal, but it was also clear. The dam of his silence, built on fear and complicity, was about to break. Kevin Reed's confession was a floodgate opening. For days, he sat with Marcus, Ramirez, and an attorney from the district attorney's office, detailing years of corruption. He was a man unburdening a soul that had grown too heavy. He recounted the night of the hit and run. Kyle Bennett, drunk and high on cocaine, had called his father in a panic after hitting the teenager on the bike. Robert Bennett had called his consultant, Dale Keller. Keller had arrived on the scene even before the official paramedics. He'd coached Kyle on his alibi, taken him home, and then returned to the scene to officially discover it, carefully steering the investigation away from the Bennetts from the very first moment. Reed, a rookie at the time, had been told to keep his mouth shut if he valued his career, and he had. He detailed the protection racket, how Bennett would flag a problem, a health code violation at a rival restaurant, a zoning issue for a new competitor, and Keller would use the power of his badge to harass and intimidate them until the problem went away. The consulting fees were payments for this illegal enforcement. Armed with Reed's detailed sworn testimony, Marcus and the DA had everything they needed. Reed, in exchange for his full cooperation, was offered a plea deal. He would plead guilty to lesser charges of conspiracy and malfeasance, with a recommendation for probation and community service instead of prison time. He would lose his career, his right to own a firearm, and the respect of many in the town, but he wouldn't lose his freedom. It was a steep price, but it was nothing compared to what was coming for the others. The arrests were coordinated to be swift and simultaneous. Detective Ramirez and two state troopers, not Harmony Creek officers, had the honor of arresting Dale Keller. They found him in his backyard, arrogantly sipping a beer by his oversized swimming pool. "Dale Keller, you're under arrest for racketeering, evidence tampering, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to commit manslaughter," Ramirez stated, her voice ringing with the satisfaction of long-delayed justice. Keller's face went from smug disbelief to purple rage. "You can't be serious. This is because of that punk Hale. It's a setup," he bellowed as they cuffed him. His neighbors peeked through their blinds, watching the untouchable Dale Keller being brought down. As they led him away in handcuffs past his expensive boat and his perfectly manicured lawn, all fruits of his corruption, the true karma of the situation began to settle in. The man who had abused his power on a dark road was now being publicly stripped of it in the bright afternoon sun. At the same time, Marcus Hale, accompanied by the DA herself, walked into the opulent offices of Bennett Enterprises. Robert Bennett, a man accustomed to buying his way out of any problem, tried to bluff and threaten his way out of this one. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," Bennett snarled as Marcus presented him with the arrest warrant. "Oh, I think I do," Marcus replied coolly. "You're a man who thought he was above the law. In Harmony Creek, you might have been right, but the law has a new chief now. The arrests of the town's most powerful businessman and its most feared cop sent an earthquake through Harmony Creek." The Chronicle's headline now screamed, "Corruption Scandal Rocks HC, Officer and Businessman Arrested in Hit-and-Run Cover-Up." The fall was as brutal as it was complete. Faced with Reed's testimony and the mountain of financial evidence Ramirez had compiled, Robert Bennett's legal team quickly arranged a plea deal to avoid a racketeering charge that carried a long sentence. He pleaded guilty to obstruction of justice and accessory after the fact, receiving a sentence of years in state prison and millions in fines. His business empire crumbled. For Dale Keller, there was no deal. He was the architect of the Irot. He went to trial, arrogant and defiant to the end. Kevin Reed testified against him, his voice shaking but steady, detailing every crime he had witnessed. The jury took little time to convict him on all counts. The judge, calling Keller a cancer on the community, sentenced him to a long term in a maximum security prison. On the day of the sentencing, Marcus saw Keller being led from the courthouse in chains. Their eyes met for a brief moment. There was no triumph in Marcus's gaze, only a profound sense of closure. Keller's eyes held nothing but raw, impotent hatred. He had tied a man to a pole to feel powerful, and in doing so, he had authored his own complete and utter destruction. The hard karma he had sown on that crooked county road had finally come home to roost. Months later, the oppressive humidity of the past summer had broken, giving way to a crisp, clear autumn that seemed to mirror the town's own change in atmosphere. The thick cloud of unspoken fear and ingrained corruption that had hung over the community for decades was beginning to dissipate, replaced by the tentative, fragile light of a new morning. The Harmony Creek Police Department was the epicenter of this transformation. The building itself felt different. Chief Marcus Hale had insisted on a deep clean and a fresh coat of paint, a simple symbolic act of scrubbing away the past. The lingering scent of his predecessor's stale cigars was gone, replaced by the smell of strong, freshly brewed coffee and the low, professional hum of a department at work. The changes, however, were far more than cosmetic. They were woven into the very fabric of the department's culture. In the same briefing room where he had been revealed as chief, Marcus now held weekly training sessions. This week's topic was body camera footage review. On a large monitor at the front of the room, footage played from a young, eager officer who had been hired recently, The video showed a tense domestic call, a husband and wife screaming at each other on their front lawn. "All right, pause it there," Marcus commanded. The image froze. "Officer, talk us through your thought process here." The young officer stood up straight. "My first instinct, Chief, was to go in hard. Separate them immediately." The old training would have been to assert dominance. "And what did you do instead?" Marcus asked, his gaze sweeping the room. "I followed the new protocol, sir," the officer said, his confidence growing. "I kept my distance, used a calm, low tone of voice, and addressed them by their names. I asked questions, I listened. Within minutes, they were both talking to me instead of screaming at each other. We de-escalated without ever laying a hand on anyone." Marcus nodded, a flicker of pride in his eyes. "Exactly. Dominance is a tool for the weak. Control of yourself, control of the situation, that is real strength. That is policing." He looked around the room at the mix of new faces and veteran officers who had weathered the storm. "Every one of you has this footage reviewed, not for gotcha moments, but for training, to get better, to be worthy of the trust this community is trying to place in us again." That trust was being rebuilt brick by painful brick. The new Citizen Oversight Committee, once a radical idea, was now a cornerstone of the new department. In the town hall, Marcus and his new second-in-command, Lieutenant Sofia Ramirez, sat at a long table facing a panel of citizens. A woman named Mrs. Gable, who had filed multiple complaints against Dale Keller over the years, all of which had been lost, was now the committee's chair. She looked at Marcus with eyes that were no longer fearful, but demanding. "Chief Hale," she said, her voice firm, "we have a report here about an officer being discourteous during a traffic stop. What is the department's plan to address this?" Instead of getting defensive, Marcus listened intently. "Thank you for bringing this to our attention, Mrs. Gable. Lieutenant Ramirez will personally speak with the officer involved. He'll be assigned remedial training and community interaction, and we will follow up with the citizen who filed the complaint to ensure his satisfaction. We don't hide from our mistakes anymore. We learn from them." For Sofia Ramirez, this new era was a personal and professional vindication. Her new office, which had once belonged to a crony of the old chief, was organized and efficient. On her wall was not a plaque for being a good old boy, but a framed copy of the department's new stringent code of ethics, which she had co-authored with Marcus. She had spent years watching men like Keller fail upward, their corruption excused as the way things are. Now she was an architect of a new way. She was not just respected, she was instrumental. She was finally the police officer she had always wanted to be in a department she could finally be proud of. The consequences for those who had perpetuated the old ways had been severe and lasting. Kevin Reed was living out the quiet karma of his cowardice. His plea deal had spared him prison, but his life was a shadow of what it had been. His community service often involved cleaning parks or painting over graffiti in the very neighborhoods he used to patrol with a swagger. Sometimes he would see people he had once wrongly stopped or intimidated, and the shame would wash over him, a hot, sickening wave. His wife Sarah had divorced him, unable to live with the man he had allowed himself to become. Yet in the ruins of his old life, something new was growing. Forced to confront his moral failures every single day, he was slowly, painfully atoning. He was a better father to his daughter on his bi-weekly visits than he ever had been as a hero cop, teaching her the lessons of honesty and accountability he had learned far too late. For Dale Keller, there was no redemption. He was inmate number in a maximum security state prison. The sprawling green lawn and expensive boat had been replaced by a small concrete cell. The fear and respect he had commanded on the streets of Harmony Creek were gone, replaced by the brutal, indifferent hierarchy of prison life. He was no longer the predator. He was potential prey. He spent his days replaying his downfall, his mind a toxic brew of rage and self-pity. In his telling, he was the victim framed by a vindictive chief and betrayed by a weak partner. His appeals were baseless and quickly dismissed. The man who saw power as a tool for his own amusement had become utterly powerless. A cautionary tale whispered to new recruits about the cancer of a corrupted badge. One cool October evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and purple, Marcus Hale drove his car down that same deserted county road. He pulled over and got out, the air crisp and clean. He walked to the old rusted utility pole, half swallowed by the dying kudzu of autumn. He ran his hand over the rough creosote-treated wood. He could still feel it all, the bite of the zip ties, the sting of the mosquitoes, the deep, burning humiliation of being rendered helpless. But the memory was no longer a source of pain. It had become a touchstone, a permanent physical reminder of his purpose. This pole was not a monument to his suffering, but to the moment of absolute clarity it had provided. He hadn't come to Harmony Creek seeking revenge. He had come to do a job. The horrifying events of that night had simply revealed the true nature and scale of that job. Keller and Reed, in their blind, pathetic arrogance, had believed they were teaching a lesson to some nameless, faceless man they deemed beneath them. They thought they were asserting their dominance, having a bit of cruel fun on a boring night. The supreme irony was that their actions had given their unknown adversary the one thing he needed most: a righteous and undeniable cause. They had armed him with the moral authority to tear down their corrupt kingdom. They had tied a man to a pole, not knowing he was their new chief. But in the end, with their own hands and their own hate, they had only succeeded in tying themselves to the unbreakable post of justice, leaving them abandoned on the side of the road as the world and a new, better Harmony Creek moved on without them. The story of Chief Marcus Hale is a stark and powerful reminder that karma isn't some mystical force. It's the natural and often brutal consequence of our own actions. Dale Keller and Kevin Reed believed they operated in a world without consequences, protected by a badge and a broken system. They learned that the very power they abused could be the instrument of their downfall. This story shows that true strength isn't found in intimidation or cruelty, but in unshakable integrity and the courage to stand for what is right, even when you're standing alone, tied to a pole in the dark. It proves that one person's refusal to be broken can be the spark that ignites a revolution of accountability. If this story of justice and hard-hitting karma resonated with you, and if you believe in the power of holding people accountable for their actions, please help us share it. Hit that like button, share this video with your friends and family, and subscribe to our channel for more real-life stories that matter. Click the notification bell so you never miss an update. Thank you for listening.